win a spectacular, entertaining, back-and-forth game versus a young, competitive Seattle Storm team. That front court they have is going to be one to deal with for a time to come. We'll get into that, but we got to start with the Clark Show, baby. Hey, Asia Wilson, what you got to say? Y'all still want to have a meeting at All-Star break? If we have a meeting at All-Star break, let's talk about how she broke a record. The only player.
There are nights in professional sports that don't just make headlines. There are nights that fundamentally alter the architecture of an entire institution. Nights where the invisible machinery grinding behind the scenes gets exposed so completely, so brutally, that not even the most powerful executives in the room can pretend it doesn't exist anymore. This was one of those nights. And if you weren't watching closely, if you let the post-game spin cycle do its work before you had a chance to process what actually happened on that hardwood, then sit down, because we're going to walk through every single second of what went down. The scoring, the history, the whispers from the luxury suites, and the very real question of whether professional women's basketball just reached a point of no return. Because what happened inside that arena didn't just break records, it cracked the foundation of a league that spent the better part of a year trying to manage, contain, and quietly diminish the most electric player it has ever seen. And the terrifying part? She wasn't even supposed to play this well tonight. They made absolutely sure of that. But you cannot cage a force of nature. And last night, Caitlin Clark reminded every single person watching exactly why some forces cannot be caged. Long before the opening whistle, before the arena lights finished warming up, and before the starting lineups were even announced, something was already happening near the scorer's table that had nothing to do with basketball. High-level league insiders, people with eyes and ears embedded at every layer of this organization, spotted representatives directly connected to Adam Silver's executive office engaged in deep, hushed conversations with members of the officiating crew. Not a casual greeting, not a quick handshake, a deliberate, extended exchange with the kind of body language that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up if you knew what you were looking at. Now, let's be precise here. Nobody recorded the words being exchanged. Nobody is claiming to have a transcript of what was said in those pre-game conversations. But context is everything in this league. And the context surrounding this particular game was already loaded with enough pressure to make those conversations look like anything but coincidence. The narrative had been set. The media had their scripts ready. The talking heads had already decided what story they were going to tell about this game before a single shot went up. The story was simple. The rookie wall has arrived. The phenomenon is slowing down. The league's establishment has finally figured her out. That was the assignment. That was what the sports media industrial complex needed to happen. Because without that story, without that correction in the narrative, the entire system built around managing expectations and controlling the cultural momentum of this league was in danger of collapsing. Veteran players with decades of credibility were quietly being positioned as the real story. The league's traditional power centers, the organizations with rings, with pedigree, with deep relationships inside the commissioner's office, were being reminded that they still mattered, that the hype around one player, no matter how justified, needed to be measured against the broader landscape. The instructions filtering down through the chain seemed to point in one direction. Call it tight, make it physical for her, let the defense work. Don't let the rookie dictate pace, and whatever you do, don't let this game become a showcase for one player at the expense of the league's credibility with its established stars. There's a word for what that is, and it isn't basketball, but the league has been playing this particular game for a long time, and they've gotten very, very good at making it invisible. Last night, it stopped being invisible. Here's the part of the story that doesn't get talked about enough. The part that gets buried under the celebratory stat lines and the highlight packages that flood social media in the hours after a performance like this. Because even if you set aside the officiating entirely, even if you give the referees the benefit of every single doubt about the uncalled jersey tugs, the blindside screens, and the physical double teams that were being allowed to go on with complete impunity, you still have to answer for what was happening on that bench. Every time she crossed half court, the defensive aggression was reaching levels that would have gotten players ejected in almost any other context. Defenders were making contact before she even established her dribble. Screens were being set at angles specifically designed to catch her off guard and unseen. And when the contact came, and it came repeatedly, consistently, with a pattern that was impossible to mistake, the officials swallowed their whistles and let it go.
In only 74 games, Caitlin Clark becomes the fastest player in WNBA history to reach 200 career three-pointers. Put on the shirt and tie, because damn it, we mean business. We meant business today. Cheers to Caitlin Clark. 3 records broken in one game. The girl's unreal. The girl is unreal. Take a look at this here, man. Caitlin Clark, 45 points, 10 assists, 4 steals, 2 blocks.
On the bench, the coaching staff stood with their arms crossed, not demanding, not pressing the officials, not protecting their franchise player with the kind of vocal, visible advocacy that any other star on any other team would have received without question. There was a passivity in that bench presence that went beyond strategic calculation. It looked, to anyone watching closely, like a staff that had either been instructed to stay quiet or had made a deliberate choice to let the situation play out without interference. Coaching staff inaction during officiating controversies is not a new phenomenon in professional sports, but when that inaction is directed at your most valuable, most visible, most globally followed player, the one carrying the entire ratings architecture of your franchise on her shoulders, it stops being a tactical decision and starts looking like something else entirely. Reports from sources positioned directly behind the bench described a moment during a first-quarter timeout that made the entire situation crystallize in real time. She came off the floor during that timeout and sat down. The coach went to the whiteboard, drew up the play, laid out the assignments, and she looked at it, looked up at the stadium ceiling, reached down, tied her laces tighter, and made a decision that you could almost feel ripple through the arena before the buzzer even sounded to end the timeout. If they won't fight for her, she would make fighting for her irrelevant. She would simply win by margins so obscene that no narrative, no officiating crew, and no corporate spin machine could survive them. What happened over the next 3 quarters was not a basketball game in any traditional sense of the term. It was a systematic, cold-blooded destruction of every defensive scheme, every strategic adjustment, and every psychological attempt to destabilize a player who had clearly decided that the concept of limits no longer applied to her. She didn't just start shooting. There's a difference between a player who is hot and a player who is hunting. And what she was doing from the moment that first quarter timeout ended was hunting. From 28 feet, from 30 feet, from 35 feet out, distances that most professional players don't even consider within the frame of a legitimate offensive action. She was pulling up and putting the ball through the net with a consistency that made the arena go quiet in that particular way, that collective, breathless silence that only happens when a crowd realizes they are watching something they will tell people about for the rest of their lives. The ball wasn't even brushing the rim. It was pure, clean velvet. Shot after shot after shot. The kind of shooting that doesn't just score points, but psychologically dismantles a defense because there is simply no answer for it. You can't guard someone from 35 feet on every possession. You can't extend your defense to half court without opening up driving lanes and collapsing your entire system. And she knew that. She was using the range as a weapon, not just to score, but to create chaos, to stretch the defense to its breaking point, and then exploit every crack that opened up. And the assists,
Let's talk about the vision, because the scoring gets all the attention, but the playmaking was operating on a completely different plane of basketball intelligence. She was driving through traffic, drawing multiple defenders, collapsing the entire defensive structure of the opposing team, and then, in the fraction of a second between contact and call, finding teammates who were so open they barely had to move to catch the ball. No-look passes, behind-the-back passes, passes that required not just awareness of where every player on the court was positioned, but predictive awareness of where they were going to be half a second later. That's not just basketball skill, that's a level of spatial processing that you genuinely cannot coach into a player. Either it's there or it isn't. And in her, it is there in quantities that belong in a conversation about the greatest playmakers this game has ever produced. The stat sheet was updating so quickly that the arena's live broadcast computers were struggling to keep pace. Commentators who had walked into that building with corporate talking points about parity and the rising quality of league-wide competition completely abandoned their prepared material by the end of the half. By the third quarter, they weren't commentating anymore, they were witnessing. There's a difference, and you could hear it in their voices. Let's stop and be precise about what the stat line actually read when that final buzzer sounded, because the numbers deserve to be stated plainly, without theatrical packaging, because they are theatrical enough on their own.
45 points, 10 assists, 4 steals, 2 blocks, 11 of 18 from the field, 6 of 10 from three-point range, and she did this in 29 minutes of playing time, which means the per-minute production was operating at a level that makes the final numbers look conservative when you extrapolate them across a full game. This was the first time in the entire history of the WNBA, a league that has existed for decades, filled with Hall of Famers, legends, and generational talents at every position, that any player had recorded 40 or more points and 10 or more assists in a single game. The first time ever. Think about the players who have played in this league. Think about the careers, the records, the championships, and not once in all of that accumulated basketball history had anyone done what she did last night. She also became the fastest player in WNBA history to reach 200 career three-pointers, hitting the milestone in just 74 games. Records that took other players hundreds of games to approach were being crossed in a fraction of the time. The franchise scoring record, every point ever scored by any Indiana Fever player in a single game, was erased and rewritten. Players who held those records, veterans who had built careers inside this organization, watched from the bench or from their living rooms as their names were removed from the history books and replaced with hers. And she did all of this while absorbing physical contact that went unprotected and uncalled. She did it while fighting through schemes designed specifically to disrupt her rhythm. She did it with a coaching staff that wasn't fully in her corner and an officiation crew that had received instructions from whatever conversation happened near the scorer's table before tip-off to let the game be played at a physicality level that seemed strategically calibrated to slow her down. The only problem? You cannot slow down someone operating at that frequency. You can slow down a good player. You can slow down a great player. You cannot slow down what she was last night. The crowd that filled that arena at tip-off was not a neutral crowd. It was a mix that included a significant contingent of rival fans who had come specifically hoping to see the opposite of what happened. They came with the energy of people who had read the same media narratives and arrived ready to watch the hype get deflated in real time. The first few minutes, there was noise and opposition and the kind of hostility that a visiting player learns to use as fuel or gets swallowed by. She used it as fuel. By the second quarter, the hostility had started to crack at the edges. A few made shots will do that to a crowd. By the midpoint of the third quarter, something had shifted in the arena's collective emotional state that was audible in the broadcast, a kind of stunned resignation that is different from being impressed, different from being entertained.
It's what happens when a crowd that came to watch someone fail realizes that they have accidentally become witnesses to something historic. The human brain cannot maintain manufactured opposition in the face of undeniable excellence for very long. At some point, the circuitry recalibrates and the crowd just watches. By the fourth quarter, the rival fans had gone quiet. Not because their team wasn't still fighting, it was, but because the level of basketball being played on the other side of the court had reached a frequency that transcended team loyalty and rivalry energy. You don't boo something that you will spend the next 10 years telling people you were there to see. The crowd understood that before the final buzzer. The silence of converted skeptics is a very particular kind of silence, and the arena was full of it. The game-sealing moment came with the score tied at 102, a play that in any other game, any other context, would have been the single image burned into the cultural memory of the night. Off the inbound, from a distance that required either complete confidence or complete derangement, or possibly both simultaneously, up and through. The scoreboard shifted, and she turned toward the opposing bench with an expression that needed no translation in any language. It wasn't celebration, it wasn't taunting, it was acknowledgement. A quiet, devastating acknowledgement that the outcome had been decided and that everyone in the building knew exactly why.
The moment the final buzzer sounded and the scoreboard locked in the result, something happened in the luxury suites above the arena floor that had nothing to do with celebrating and everything to do with managing a crisis. Because the people sitting in those suites were not there as fans, they were there as executives, sponsors, rights holders, and league officials. And what they had just watched for 4 quarters had implications that extended well beyond the box score. Reports from sources with direct visibility into the communications happening in and around those suites in the immediate aftermath of the game paint a picture of controlled panic, the kind of emergency communication that happens when something has occurred that was supposed to be prevented. And now everyone involved is rapidly calculating how the footage, the numbers, and the narrative are going to look in the morning. High-level marketing executives with connections inside the league's sponsor relationships have since confirmed that major network sponsors, the brands writing the largest checks to keep this league on national television, called an emergency meeting immediately following the final buzzer. Not the next morning, not the following Monday, immediately. Because the math was not complicated. The league's most commercially valuable asset, the player driving more ticket sales, jersey purchases, broadcast rating spikes, and social media engagement than any other entity in the organization, had just put up the greatest individual performance in the history of the league, and the officiating and coaching decisions surrounding that performance were going to be replayed, analyzed, and dissected on every major sports platform on Earth for the foreseeable future. The broadcast ratings for the game peaked during the fourth quarter at numbers that the league had not seen in years. The world, it turns out, does not care about the internal politics of a professional sports organization. The world cares about phenomenon. And the ratings proved with the cold objectivity of data that the phenomenon was not being manufactured by hype or media packaging or social media algorithms. The phenomenon was real, and it was playing out in real time on their screens, and they were watching in the largest numbers the league could remember. Adam Silver, according to sources with knowledge of his private communications in the hours following the game, has expressed deep personal concern about how the officiating decisions from the night are being perceived on international broadcast streams, not just domestic, international. Because the global appetite for this player has created a situation where a game played in an American arena is being watched and analyzed by people in countries that have no particular allegiance to any team in this league, people who are simply there to watch the player.
And those international viewers, without the filter of domestic media politics or the corporate talking points that get distributed to sports analysts before big games, are simply watching the footage and drawing their own conclusions. The conclusions are not flattering to the league's officiating department. Buried inside the celebration, somewhere between the stat line breakdowns and the highlight packages, is a conversation that the organization is going to have very publicly and very soon, because the coaching staff decisions surrounding this game were not invisible, and in the context of a 45-point, 10-assist performance from a player who spent significant stretches of the game dealing with a hostile officiating environment without any visible advocacy from her bench, the decisions look like more than just strategy. The minutes restriction has been the official organizational position for weeks now. The explanation given to media, repeated at press conferences, and framed as a responsible approach to player health and long-term performance management. The medical staff is making these decisions, not the coaching staff. Keep that framing in mind, because it becomes relevant when you look at who was delivering that message in the broadcast booth. Reporters and media observers who were paying attention to the commentary layer during the broadcast noticed something interesting. The announcers offering the most detailed and sympathetic explanation for the minutes restriction, the voices most actively providing cover for the organizational decision to limit her floor time, especially in crunch time defensive situations, were individuals with direct financial and professional connections to the Indiana Fever organization, not neutral observers, not independent analysts, people whose livelihoods are tied to the franchise they were being asked to explain. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's media economics operating exactly as it always has. But in the context of a night where the organizational decisions around her deployment were being called into question in real time by fans, former players, and legitimate sports analysts, it becomes relevant context. If the people providing the most favorable explanation for the coaching staff decisions are the ones being paid by the organization those decisions belong to, that is information the viewing public deserves to have when evaluating those explanations.
Sources close to Clark's inner circle reported that she spoke up for herself before this game in ways that were direct and pointed. She did not accept the official framing quietly. She made her position clear. And the fact that the broadcast narrative immediately moved to provide organizational cover for the minutes restriction in language that just happened to be delivered by voices connected to the franchise tells you something about how carefully this situation is being managed from the inside. The specific moment that crystallized this issue came in the final minutes of the game during a defensive crunch time situation where the coaching staff chose not to deploy her. She had just made what multiple observers described as a genuinely elite defensive play, the kind of play that should have resulted in her being trusted on the floor at the most critical moment of the game. Instead, the organizational choice was to keep her off the court. The game was close enough that the decision was meaningful, and the optics of keeping your best player on the bench during a high-leverage defensive situation after a game where the officiating environment had been hostile and the physical treatment had been aggressive was not a good look. The fans noticed, the internet noticed, and the voices in the post-game conversation that asked pointed questions about that specific decision were not fringe critics. They were people who watch this game closely and understand what deployment decisions in crunch time communicate about how much an organization truly trusts its most important player. There is a particular behavior pattern that emerges from professional sports media in the hours after a performance that makes their pre-game narrative impossible to defend. You've seen it before. The social media accounts that spent 24 hours building the case for why the hype was overblown go quiet. The takes that were confidently positioned as contrarian wisdom disappear into drafts folders. The comment sections under previous posts get disabled, or the posts themselves get quietly deleted before the morning scroll begins.
This is what happened in the hours following the game. The analysts who had spent the week constructing their talking points about the rookie wall, about the league figuring her out, about how the veteran talent was superior and the coverage was disproportionate, they went silent. Not because they changed their minds necessarily, but because the data was now public and permanent, and 45 points and 10 assists is not a statistic you can explain away with narrative framing. You cannot tell 45 points it doesn't count. You cannot tell the first 40-point 10-assist game in league history that it happened in the wrong context. You cannot dismiss 200 career three-pointers in 74 games as overrated. The numbers exist in the official record books now. They will exist there permanently. They were real before the critics wanted to accept them, and they remain real after the critics have chosen to accept them, and the critics' acceptance or denial has precisely zero impact on their validity. The hostility that greeted her in some corners of the sports media world was never really about basketball anyway. It never is when it reaches the kind of intensity that hers reached. There is a version of resistance to certain athletes that gets dressed up in analytical language and technical basketball discussion. But underneath the analysis, the resistance is about something else, about who is being celebrated, about who the mainstream attention is going toward, about whether the establishment feels comfortable with the speed and scale of a cultural shift it didn't control or predict. That resistance, when it goes up against 45 points and 10 assists and historical records and global audience ratings, does not have anywhere to go. It cannot win the argument because the argument has already been settled by the game itself. What you're left with, in the silence of the turned-off comment sections and the deleted tweets and the talk show hosts who suddenly have other things to discuss on Monday, is the acknowledgement that the narrative failed. The setup failed. The officiating environment failed. The bench passivity failed. All of it, working in the same direction, failed to produce the outcome that was needed. And she stood there at the final buzzer with 45 points in 29 minutes and a stat line that had never existed in the history of the league, having accomplished all of it in spite of, not because of, the systems that were supposed to be working in her favor. Here's where the conversation has to move to, because the historical record-breaking and the corporate panic and the media narrative collapse are all secondary to the structural question that this gain forced into the open. The Indiana Fever and the WNBA as an institution are now in a position that has a finite number of exits, and none of them are comfortable.
Option 1, the organization acknowledges what happened, makes visible changes to how its most valuable player is coached, protected, and advocated for, and commits to a genuinely different relationship with the officiating standards that apply when she is on the floor. This option costs something. It costs the people who made decisions that put her in an adversarial situation with her own bench and her own officiating crew the admission that those decisions were wrong. Institutional pride being what it is, this option tends to be the last one organizations reach for. Option 2, the organization continues on its current trajectory. The minutes restrictions, the bench passivity, the organizational cover narratives delivered through connected broadcast voices, and watches the internal contradictions of that approach become increasingly public and increasingly damaging. The ratings data, the sponsor pressure, and the global audience numbers are all moving in a direction that makes this option progressively more expensive with every passing game. The sponsors who called an emergency meeting after last night's game are not going to have infinite patience for an organizational approach that actively suppresses the asset they are paying to associate with. Option 3, and this is the one that nobody in the league's front office wants to say out loud, the credibility of the entire enterprise collapses under the accumulated weight of its own contradictions, and the story the league ends up being remembered for in this era is the story of the institution that tried to manage and contain its most transformative figure and paid a permanent reputational price for it.
History has seen all three of these play out. Sometimes institutions adapt, sometimes they dig in, and sometimes the force they're trying to contain simply becomes so large that the institution's behavior becomes a footnote to the larger story of the person they were trying to stop. Based on last night, it's becoming increasingly clear which direction this particular story is heading. At the end of the day, the awards committees will meet in their rooms and make their decisions. The league office will issue its statements, the coaching staff will hold its press conferences, the officials will file their game reports, the corporate sponsors will calculate their next moves, and all of that institutional machinery will grind forward the way it always does, distributing credit and recognition according to the internal politics and power structures that have always governed these decisions. None of it will matter. Not in the way that the people making those decisions think it will matter. Because the public verdict was delivered last night in real time, and it was delivered by the 45 points on the scoreboard, by the broadcast ratings that peaked in the fourth quarter, by the social media engagement that overwhelmed every metric the league tracks, by the international streams that showed audiences watching from countries that don't even have NBA franchises, watching because of one person, one player, one performance that transcended everything the institutional machinery was trying to build around it. You don't vote on phenomenon. You don't award it through committee. You don't manage it into existence by deciding which players deserve the attention and which ones need to be given more time to develop their narratives. Phenomenon happens or it doesn't, and when it does happen, it belongs to the public before it belongs to any institution. The public took ownership of Caitlin Clark a long time ago, long before last night, long before this game. The public saw something and recognized it for what it was, and attached to it with the kind of organic, unmanufactured enthusiasm that no marketing department can produce, because it comes from the game itself and not from any campaign. Last night, that public ownership was confirmed in the kind of language that cannot be misread. 45 points, 10 assists, 4 steals, 2 blocks. The first player in WNBA history to do what she did. The records that now have her name where other names used to be. The rookie season that is no longer a rookie season in any meaningful sense, because what she is producing goes beyond any category or framework the league built before she arrived.
The haters who wanted the rookie wall to arrive are now forced to explain why the wall, instead of stopping her, produced a performance that no player in the league's entire history had ever managed. The establishment that wanted her contained is now forced to explain to its sponsors and its broadcast partners and its international audience why its containment strategy looked the way it did on camera. The coaching staff that kept her on the bench during crunch-time defensive moments is now forced to justify those decisions in the context of a player who made an elite defensive play in the closing minutes of a game they barely won. None of those are comfortable conversations. None of those are conversations the institution wanted to have. They were forced into them by 29 minutes of basketball that produced a stat line that will live in the official records of this league as long as the league itself exists. One of the strange things about genuinely historic moments is that the people inside them often don't fully register what they're witnessing until later. The crowd that went quiet in the fourth quarter, the commentators who abandoned their scripts, the executives making frantic phone calls from luxury suites, all of them were in the middle of something they would spend years processing, and the full weight of it wouldn't settle until long after the arena lights went off. But there were people in that building who understood it in real time. Fans who had driven hours to be there. People who had followed this player from before she was a professional athlete, who had watched the trajectory of her career with the kind of close attention that only genuine passion produces. Those people understood immediately what the numbers meant, what the records meant, what the first 40-point, 10-assist game in league history meant. They were watching the official beginning of something, not the peak of something, and that distinction matters. The most dangerous entity in professional sports is not the most talented player in a league.
The most dangerous entity is the most talented player in a league who has receipts, who has documented evidence in official box scores and broadcast footage and broadcast ratings data and sponsor emergency meeting minutes of every attempt to contain them and every failure of that containment. That documentation builds and builds, and it tells a story, and the story becomes part of the player's legacy in a way that makes them larger and more culturally significant than any single performance could. She now has those receipts. She has had them for a while, if we're being precise, but after last night, she has them in quantities that cannot be disputed or explained away. The officiating patterns, the coaching decisions, the bench passivity, the pre-game conversations near the scorer's table, all of it is part of the official story now, alongside the 45 points and the history-making and the records that will stand until someone else comes along to break them. The institution tried to write one story, the game wrote a different one, and the game's version is the one that goes into the record books. In the immediate aftermath, as the arena began to empty and the broadcast crews began wrapping their cables and the social media landscape began filling with clips and reactions and analysis, the Indiana Fever organization was left to face a very particular kind of reckoning. Not the comfortable kind where a team wins and everyone gets credit for the system working, the uncomfortable kind where a player wins in spite of the system and everyone has to figure out what that means for the system going forward. Kelsey Mitchell played her game. She put up good numbers. She competed. But the final accounting of the night belonged to one player and one performance and one stat line that made everything else in the box score look like background detail. The supporting cast played their roles. The young players on both sides showed real promise. Dominique Malanga with 28 points and 14 rebounds, Flo with 16 points and 6 boards, the kind of young talent that will define this league's next decade. The game itself, stripped of all the political and institutional context, was a genuinely thrilling competition that went down to the final possession. But nobody outside of the immediate families of the other players is going to remember the final score first. They're going to remember the 45 points. They're going to remember the historic assist total. They're going to remember the game-sealing bomb from an impossible distance with the score tied. And they're going to remember the fact that she did all of it while absorbing contact that went unprotected, with a bench that wasn't fully in her corner, against a defensive scheme that was allowed levels of physical aggression that the officials had been implicitly given permission to ignore.
That's the story. That's the whole story. And the franchise that was supposed to be her home, the organization that was supposed to be the vehicle for everything she's doing in this league, now has to decide whether it wants to be remembered as the system she overcame or the system she was finally allowed to operate within without obstruction. The choice belongs to them. The legacy, either way, already belongs to her. History doesn't negotiate. It doesn't wait for institutional comfort or corporate alignment or the approval of the people who would have preferred a different outcome. It happens, it gets recorded, and then it exists permanently in the documents and the data and the memory of everyone who witnessed it directly. Last night, history happened. The record books were rewritten in real time. The first 40-point, 10-assist game in WNBA history. The fastest player to 200 career three-pointers, the franchise scoring record, the broadcast ratings peak, the sponsor emergency meetings, the executive luxury suite panic, the quiet that fell over a hostile crowd when it realized it was watching something it had never seen before and might never see again. All of it is now permanent. The receipts are in the official records. The footage exists on every streaming platform and in every sports archive. The stats are in the history books. The ratings data is in the league's own files. The sponsor communications are in the email servers of the organizations that sent them. None of it can be walked back, deleted, managed, or reframed into a different meaning. They tried to contain it. They tried to slow it down. They tried to manage it through officiating crews and bench passivity and broadcast narratives delivered through organizationally connected voices. They had the system working in one direction,
and a player who decided in the quiet of a first-quarter timeout, with her laces tied tighter and her eyes on the ceiling, that the system was going to have to catch up to her. It couldn't. It didn't. It won't. 45 points, 10 assists, history, written in gold. And there is absolutely nothing, not tonight, not tomorrow morning, not in any boardroom or executive suite or officiating review meeting that can change a single letter of it. The question now isn't whether what happened last night was real. The question is whether the people running this league are brave enough to let it keep happening. And based on the panic in those suites, based on the emergency sponsor calls, based on the international ratings data sitting on Adam Silver's desk this morning, the people running this league are starting to understand that they don't actually have a choice anymore. She took the choice away from them last night, 45 points at a time.